I'm Zarina Matcha, and you're watching The Rational Female. I have been researching feminism for several years, ever since I was about 14. It's always been a topic of great interest to me because I am a woman, and obviously I would be supporting any movement that claims to be the champion of women's rights and liberty. Feminism has always prided itself on being the movement for women's liberation and gender equality. Feminists tell women that we are oppressed by a patriarchal society and that the solution is to become a feminist, overthrow the patriarchy to establish whatever society that feminists want. A society where the future is female. When I was in sixth form, I was part of the Feminist Society, as I've discussed in previous videos. It was really through talking to and listening to other feminists, particularly things they'd say about rape culture and patriarchy, that I became very critical of contemporary feminism. I began to reject the label of feminist and instead called myself an egalitarian. I started posting about why I wasn't a feminist anymore on my blog, which I formed in 2017 at the age of 20, and claimed that modern feminism wasn't really necessary anymore. Through continuous research and discussions with others on my blog, including one incredible woman whom I won't name, but who was actually very instrumental in opening me up to rethinking many of my positions, I came to reject the view that post-1960s feminism was ever a good thing. 3 books that particularly influenced me upon this are The Flip Side of Feminism by Suzanne Venker, Who Stole Feminism by Christina Hoff-Sommers, and Free Women, Free Men by Camille Paglia. All 3 of these books critique post-1960s feminism, otherwise known as second wave feminism, and rightly state that second wave feminism was based on a lie. For example, feminism did not get American women equal pay or play any role in gaining women equal pay. The Equal Pay Act in America was passed in 1963 as part of President John F. Kennedy's New Frontier, and the National Organization for Women, an organization formed by Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem, the women who began the second wave feminist movement, was formed in 1966, 3 years after American women had been given equal pay and also already had the right to vote. Well, white American women did anyway. Thus, the position that I held from 2020 up until now, which I have been pushing on my channel, has been a critique of post-1960s feminism, particularly the narrative of gender being a social construct, women being oppressed by the patriarchy, marriage being an oppressive patriarchal institution, and so on. This narrative has continued to influence later incarnations of feminism, including intersectional feminism, of which our current wave of feminism is currently founded upon. There is a difference between an opinion and a fact. It's my opinion that pink is a beautiful colour, yet it is a fact that feminism did not get American women equal pay. It is also a fact that feminism is not a thank for gaining women voting rights, nor is it a fact that women of the past has always been systemically oppressed in every society purely on the basis of being female. I remember sitting in this bedroom as a teenager, struggling to get my head around this. Feminism teaches us that all of human history has been this terrible patriarchy and that women have always been oppressed. Women have always been viewed as second-class citizens, not at all on a par with men. I became convinced, like many, that feminism was once this noble, fantastic, pro-female movement that had just been corrupted and taken over and destroyed, and if we could only look to the noble feminists, not even feminist egalitarians of the past, we would return to true women's advocacy based on classical liberalism rather than Marxism. I did a live stream a short while back with 2 great content creators, Adam James and Brandon Scott. Adam mentioned a lady called Janice Fiamengo to me, and I have been listening to many of her videos. Whenever I listen to someone who is making new claims, I immediately go out and research their claims and look up everything that they have been saying. What I came to realize through doing my own research and continuing to do research is that the narrative that I and many others have been pushing about first wave feminism being some good noble thing and second wave feminism being where feminism went wrong is a narrative that became popularized by the American academic Christina Hoff-Sommers. It's interesting that while Sommers is a reputable academic who criticizes post-second wave feminism, she still calls herself a feminist. She is the factual feminist. She's not like these other pathetic, angry women with their intersectionality and their victimhood. She's the good feminist, an equity feminist, while the others are the bad ones, the gender feminists. and thus so are the Suffragettes, Mary Wollstonecraft, Olympe de Gouges, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They're so great that I didn't even refer to them as feminists. I called them women's advocates, even though they never advocated for all women, certainly not for black women. Sommers paints them all as these brilliant, noble women, excluding all of the lies, racial exclusivity, and bigotry that was heavily prominent within proto-feminism and first-wave feminism. It turns out that I have actually been horribly wrong, and like many others, have been taken in by a lie which the feminists themselves have created and perpetuated and continue to perpetuate over and over again to manipulate us all into thinking that feminism was ever a good thing. By controlling both sides, you never realize that they are on the same side. What Christina Hoff-Sommers has actually done is a form of controlled opposition by painting the early first-wave feminists as egalitarians who were operating within the spirit of classical liberalism and fighting for all women's suffrage. What she's actually doing is creating a narrative where she and the early feminists were the good feminists and all of the feminists post-1960s were the bad feminists, such as the title of her book, Who Stole Feminism? So here is, in brief, what I now know about feminism and is going to set the tone for future videos to come on this channel. Feminism, as I already was aware, came from the Age of Enlightenment and was one of the ideas that brought out of the French Revolution. By the way, the prefix of the term revolution is revolt, to overthrow, destroy and reset the old and bring in the new. This is very different from evolution, which is to evolve and to expand upon what is already there and to reform rather than revolt. Remember that evolution is better than revolution. One of the earliest feminist activists, or proto-feminists, was Olympe de Gouges, an extremely privileged, educated, angry woman who claimed that women were being oppressed and subject to the tyranny of men. This was during a time when Native Americans were being murdered and African Americans were not even viewed as human beings. Her narrative was later continued by Mary Wollstonecraft, another privileged, angry woman who once again claimed that women were viewed as inferior to men, even though the only person telling women that they were inferior to men was Wollstonecraft herself. What both of these women fail to understand is that the women of the past mostly accepted that men and women are different and that we work together in complementary gender roles. Women who went against the norm, like Boudica, Cleopatra, Joan of Arc, Hypatia, weren't somehow fighting the patriarchy. They were just different to the average woman. The average woman is statistically not as interested in politics as men are. The average woman is not interested in the same sorts of things that men are. Instead of respecting and appreciating the fact that most women are different to men, these women, like Gouges, Wollstonecraft, and every single feminist that came afterwards, put down, shamed, and ridiculed other women for not being as interested in the same sorts of things that they were. Wollstonecraft, like the feminists that came afterwards, did not respect the roles that women already played in society and completely undermined women's social contributions. She wasn't really thinking of women's best interests. She was thinking about what she wanted society to look like. This is something feminists have always done. Attack women who are not like them. Attack any woman who doesn't conform to what the feminists want society to look like. These women complained about women not being able to own property, yet during the feudal era, most people couldn't afford to own property. Most people pre-Enlightenment were peasants ruled by the monarchy, at least in the West. Most working men were just as oppressed as women were, far more so than these extremely privileged, wealthy white women. When a man and a woman got married, they became one unit, and it didn't really make sense for the property to be in the name of both the man and the woman. In a marriage, it makes sense for the family name and the property ownership to be under one person's responsibility, and in most cases, due to lineage, not patriarchy, this responsibility was placed upon the man. The reasoning for this was the exact opposite of oppressing women. It was about providing women with a safe, secure place to raise and bear our children. Marriage wasn't invented to oppress women at all. It was invented to protect and provide for women so that a man could bear the responsibilities that his wife did not have to. That is part of what it means to be a good man who cares for his family. The term feminisme has been credited to utopian socialist Charles Fourier, whose ideas inspired Marx and Engels, and somehow out of that cocktail of ideas came the concept that the family unit and marriage was a way to oppress women, as Engels wrote in The Origins of the Family, Property and State. We need to understand Marxism to understand where the feminist concept of marriage being about oppressing women comes from. These men did not really care about women's so-called liberation. They cared about abolishing capitalism. They wanted to destroy capitalism and so claimed that marriage and the family unit was part of capitalism. This is where the Marxist, revolutionary roots of feminism originate from, a desire to destroy and revolt and rebuild society in some utopian vision. Marx did certainly highlight many problems with capitalism, but instead of offering reform and evolution, he offered revolution. He turned human relationships into a struggle of two classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and thus the idea of men and women being two classes, the oppressor and the oppressed, grew from that. Instead of wanting to evolve and reform, they wish to destroy, as we have seen with every single communist revolution. Now, I will be doing a full comprehensive history of feminism video in the future, but I'm going to skip ahead a little to the early 20th century. Here we have the suffragettes, a group of militant, angry, privileged, entitled women who used their privilege not for the betterment of society, but to shame working-class men who were standing up against the war by placing white feathers on their jackets and who bombed buildings and churches, which technically is an act of terrorism. Many women of the time, including novelist and education reformer Mary Augusta Ward, were concerned about women partaking in voting, not because of sexism, as the feminists keep telling us, but because women and men throughout most of human history, and certainly in the West, usually had different roles in society. Men worked in the public sphere and women worked in the private sphere. The reason why most politicians and philosophers and historians that we know of have been men isn't because of sexism. It's because women and men have always used our differences to work together for what's best for society as a whole. Just because women didn't vote or contribute to politics doesn't mean they didn't contribute to society in other ways. And in all honesty, it really wouldn't surprise me if there were just as many female historians and philosophers as women, and that feminists have actually suppressed that knowledge to reinforce their narrative of women always having been oppressed, which is a blatant lie. Feminists have to keep on pushing the narrative of women as second-class citizens so that women will accept feminism as our Lord and Saviour. By 1918, only 58% of British men could vote, and they had to own property, be over 30, and have lived in the UK for at least 12 months. The right to vote was part of the democratic reform of the 19th century, and more about rights for the working class, a class of men and women whom the suffragettes didn't bother to represent or even cared about. Not to mention, the suffragettes certainly didn't include or even acknowledge black men and women in their so-called noble campaign. They abandoned their campaign during the First World War, and voting rights were won on the backs of millions of men and women who worked hard during the war and who died fighting for their country in one of the most brutal wars in human history. And yet, modern history, written by the feminists, paints the suffragettes as the noble heroes of women whom we should all look to and thank for gaining female voting rights. It leaves out everything else that was going on at the time, including, rather conveniently, the White Feather Campaign, which I never even learned about when I was in school. The feminist movement of the 1960s took off on the backs of the civil rights movement, when African Americans, whom feminists have never cared about and still do not care about, were fighting for their actual human rights, and Friedan had the nerve to compare the struggles of white upper-middle-class American women to the struggles of African Americans. Womanism was created by and for black women to try and give black women a voice that had long been silenced in contemporary America, but with the rise of intersectional feminism, which dialed back to Marxist cultural analysis and a division of people into class-based oppression, womanism has now been forgotten and pushed back into the trenches, which is what happens whenever black people try and create our own movements and then assimilate into a space that was never ours to begin with. Feminism has never, ever, ever been a movement for black women, let alone for any woman really, but certainly not for black women. It is feminism that has told women that we are inferior to men and that women have always been oppressed by some conspiratorial, evil, male-dominated patriarchy. It is feminism that has belittled, mocked, and shamed the women of the past for all that they contributed to society by distorting the narrative to say that they were barred from public life, rather than accepting the actual narrative, or even considering an alternate narrative that men were the ones who were involved in public life and women were involved in the private and domestic sphere, not because of oppression, but because of division of labor based on complementary gender roles. It is feminism that has taken credit for everything that other women and men have done to make life better for women, without even bothering to offer a word of thanks to the men and the women who came before. It is feminism that continues to use feminism as an excuse for enacting social change, when social change comes from individuals who work and cooperate together, not from some hateful, misandric, female supremacist doctrine. It is feminism that encourages women to shame, bully, and gaslight any man or woman who even offers an alternative narrative. If one has to resort to hateful name-calling to get their point across by calling someone a transphobe, racist, sexist, bigot, then their point clearly lacks any real substance. Feminism has never ever been about women's equality or women's rights. Not now, not in the 1920s, not in the 1800s, not ever. Feminism comes from the Latin words fem, which means women, and ism, which means doctrine. The word literally means women's doctrine, a doctrine of hateful, bigoted female supremacy. Feminists are some of the most privileged members of society, and even the so-called good feminists still fail to tell the honest truth of its story. Any black woman or woman of color who thinks that feminism has ever been for us is either delusional or being cruelly manipulated. Any man who thinks that feminism is a good thing for men may as well be castrated, for that is what feminism has been designed to do all along: divide men and women, divide and conquer. When you castrate the male, you castrate society. The only people who have ever told women that we are being oppressed, we are inferior to men, society is a patriarchy, gender is a social construct, and that every woman of the past was some pathetic, fragile moron who needed feminism to come along and save the day are feminists. Feminism has done absolutely nothing good for women, men, or society. All feminists do is take credit for other people's achievements and attribute it to themselves so that they can pat themselves on the back and sip their champagne. I refuse to sit here and allow a small group of hateful, angry women to bully and shame everyone else into submission. The woke have insults, but we have something better: facts, truth, reason, and compassion. Feminists and their pathetic woke buddies are not true allies to people of color, especially not African Americans. The woke are the last people who truly care about black people. I mean, the term woke itself was actually stolen from the African American community, among many other things, and that is why they continue to tell us that we are being oppressed. They want us to remain as slaves. Black women should not be fooled into thinking that the feminists who run the movement have ever given a damn about us. If past civil rights activists like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King could see where their movements have brought us, they would probably be in tears. Feminists are some of the most privileged people on this planet, and they have used their privilege to hurt, lie, shame, and bully. When one is in a position of privilege, they are supposed to help lift up and empower others. They are supposed to help assist others out of bondage, not keep them in chains and tell them they are oppressed. Real heroes are people like Erin Pizzey, who created a domestic violence shelter to help men and women who were victims of abuse, or Phyllis Schlafly, who, unlike the feminists who viewed themselves as victims, actually acknowledged her privilege as a white American woman and used it to stick up for housewives and mothers who feminism launched an attack on. If you've ever read The Feminine Mystique, then you'll see that it's really just an angry polemic written by some Marxist woman who despises housewives, and instead of empowering women, she decided to turn women, American upper-middle-class white housewives, into fragile, helpless victims instead of acknowledging their personal agency and just allowing them to get on with their lives. Men and women deserve better than feminism. We can do better than feminism. I'm going to show women that we can celebrate our strengths and our abilities, and that we can maximize our potential and become the best versions of ourselves and actually improve society in ways that don't mean we must resort to victimhood. I'm going to show men that they are not oppressors and that most men have actually done a lot of good in this world and created systems and inventions designed to help improve the world, not to oppress anyone. We don't have to be divided. We don't have to be angry. They want us divided, but we can be united. We can instead look inwards and reclaim our power. We can see the world as it is and cast off the shackles of isms. At the end of the day, ists and isms cause divisions, and the word ism itself means doctrine. Feminism, Marxism, communism, even liberalism and capitalism, all of these isms are human constructs. Nobody needs feminism or some political doctrine as an excuse to help people. I do not doubt that there are self-described feminists who do actually help people and have good intentions, but their actions are not down to feminism. Their actions are down to good character and virtue. We don't need political constructs as an excuse to be good, kind, honest, and just. Feminists can send as much hatred as they wish towards me in the comments, but I look upon their hate with pity. If one has to resort to name-calling, then their movement clearly doesn't have much of a leg to stand on. People didn't die so that we could have a world full of angry people calling everyone names, or major corporations trying to dictate everyone's life choices. I sincerely believe that once people learn the truth about feminism, and learn that it's always been a hateful, dishonest movement since day one, and that it's never been about empowering women at all, but instead has always been about lying to women to keep us in chains, then all of this nonsense and bigotry shall slowly start to fall with it, like a domino effect. Thank you for watching.